Continuing with the wonderful book To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I'm going to be reading the last part of chapter 20 and the entire part of chapter 21. If you haven't already, hit the hit the like button if you want, but more importantly, hit the subscribe button. I'm almost to a certain level, and we're going to upgrade this channel. There's going to be a chat going, and it's going to be live from now on. There's going to be a lot more improvements to this, and I recommend you to check out my other 3 channels as well. So getting on with the reading, this is the end of chapter 20 and the beginning of chapter 21 in Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Her father saw it, and the defendant had testified as to his remarks. What did her father do? We don't know, but there is circumstantial evidence to indicate that Maela Uhl was beaten savagely by someone who led almost exclusively with his left. We do know in part what Mr. Uhl did. He did what any God-fearing, persevering, respectable white man would do under the circumstances. He swore out a warrant, no doubt signing it with his left hand, and Tom Robinson now sits before you, having taken the oath with the only good hand he possesses, his right hand. And so a quiet, respectable, humble Negro who had the unmitigated temerity to feel sorry for a white woman has had to put his word against 2 white peoples. I need not remind you of the appearance and conduct of the stand. You saw them for yourselves. The witnesses for the state, with the exception of the sheriff of Macon County, have presented themselves to you gentlemen, to this court, in the cynical confidence that their testimony would not be doubted, confident that you gentlemen would go along with them on the assumption, the evil assumption, that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around our women, an assumption one associates with minds of their caliber. Which, gentlemen, we know in itself is a lie as black as Tom Robinson's skin. A lie I do not have to point out to you. You know the truth, and the truth is this. Some Negroes lie, some Negroes are immoral, some Negro men are not to be trusted around women, black or white. But this is a truth that applies to the human race and to no particular race of men. This is not a person in the courtroom who has never told a lie, who has never done an immoral thing, and there is no man living who has never looked upon a woman without desire. That's the greatest point of the book that goes against racism. There's good black people, there's bad white people. There's good white people, there's bad white people. Out of every race, there's good and there's bad. There's good Asians, there's bad Asians. Atticus paused and took out his handkerchief. Then he took off his glasses and wiped them, and we saw another first. We had never seen him sweat. He was one of those men whose faces never perspired, but now it was shining tan. One more thing, gentlemen, before I quit. Thomas Jefferson once said that all men are created equal, a phrase the Yankees and the distaff side of the executive branch in Washington are fond of hurling at us. This is a tendency in the year of grace, 1935. For certain people do use this phrase out of context to satisfy all conditions. The most ridiculous example I can think of is that the people who run public education promote the stupid ideal along with the industrious. Because all men are created equal, educators will gravely tell you the children left behind suffer terrible feelings of inferiority. We know all men are not created equal in the sense some people would have us believe. Some people are smarter than others. Some people have more opportunity because they're born with it. Some men make more money than others. Some ladies make better cakes than others. Some people are born gifted beyond the normal scope of most men. It's one of the most powerful paragraphs in American literature, what I just read there. But there is one way in the country in which all men are created equal. There is one human institution that makes a papa an equal to a Rockefeller. The stupid man the equal of an Einstein. The ignorant man the equal of any college president. That institution, gentlemen, is a court. It can be the Supreme Court of the United States or the humblest JP court in the land, or this honorable court which you serve. Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution. But in this country, our courts are the great levelers. In our courts are men, all men are created equal. I'm no idealist to believe firmly in the integrity of our courts and in the jury system. This is no ideal to me. It is a living, working reality. Gentlemen, a court is no better than each man of you sitting before me on this jury. A court is only as sound as its jury, and a jury is only as sound as the men who make it up. I am confident that you gentlemen will review without passion the evidence you have heard. Come to a decision and restore this defendant to his family. In the name of God, do your duty. Atticus' voice had dropped, and as he turned away from the jury, he said something I did not catch. He said it more to himself than to the court. I punched Jim. What did he say? In the name of God, believe him. I think that's what he said. Dill suddenly reached over and tugged at Jim. Look yonder. We followed his finger with sinking hearts. Calpurnia was making her way up the middle aisle, walking straight toward Atticus. Like that's powerful, you know. That's so powerful. That's Atticus Finch's legendary for what he said there. That was under chapter 20. I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 21. So, because this is really great. Harper leaves to kill a Mockingbird, chapter 21. Okay, so Calpurnia, their maid, is walking up to the stand. She stopped shyly at the railing and waited to get Judge Taylor's attention. She was in fresh apron, and she carried an envelope in her hand. Judge Taylor saw her and said, It's Calpurnia, isn't it? Yes, sir, she said. Could I just pass this note to Mr. Finch, please, sir? It hasn't got anything to do with the trial. Judge Taylor nodded, and Atticus took the envelope from Calpurnia. He opened it, read its contents, and said, Judge, this note is for my sister. She says my children are missing, haven't turned up since noon. I know where they are, Atticus, Mr. Underwood spoke up. They're right up yonder in the colored balcony. Been there since precisely 1:18 p.m. Our father turned around and looked up. Jim, come down from here, he called. Then he said something to the judge we didn't hear. We climbed across Reverend Sykes and made our way to the staircase. Atticus and Calpurnia met us downstairs. Calpurnia looked peeved, but Atticus looked exhausted. Jim was jumping in excitement. We've won, haven't we? I have no idea, said Atticus shortly. You've been here all afternoon? Go home with Calpurnia and get some supper and stay home. Oh, Atticus, let us come back, pleaded Jim. Please, let us hear the verdict. Please, sir? The jury might be on and back in a minute. We don't know. But we could tell Atticus was relenting. Well, you've heard it all, so you might as well hear the rest. Tell you what, you can all come back when you've eaten your supper. Eat slowly now. You won't miss anything important. And if the jury's still out, you can wait with us. But I expect it'll be over before you get back. You think they'll acquit him that fast? Asked Jim. Atticus opened his mouth to answer, but shut it and left us. Man, I know, man. I hope that jury doesn't convict him. I prayed that Reverend Sykes would save our seats for us, but stopped praying when I remembered that people got up and left in droves when the jury was out. Tonight they'd overrun the drugstore, the OK Cafe, and the hotel. That is, unless they had brought their suppers too. Calpurnia marched us home. Skin every one of you alive. The very idea, you children listening to all that. Mr. Jim, don't you know better than to take your little sister to that trial? Miss Alexandra absolutely have a stroke of paralysis when she finds out. Ain't fitting to children to hear. The streetlights were on, and we glimpsed Calpurnia's indignant profile as we passed beneath them. Mr. Jim, I thought you was getting some kind of head on your shoulders. The very idea, she's your little sister. The very idea, sir, you ought to be perfectly ashamed of yourself. Ain't you got any sense at all? I was exhilarated. So many things had happened so fast I felt it would take years to sort them out. And now here was Calpurnia giving her precious Jim down the country. What new marvels will the evening bring? Jim was chuckling. Don't you worry about it, Cal. Hush your mouth, sir. When you ought to be hanging your head in shame, you go along laughing. Calpurnia revived a series of rusty threats that moved Jim to little remorse, and she sailed up the front steps with her classic, If Mr. Swinch don't wear you out, I will. Get in that house, sir. Jim went in grinning, and Calpurnia nodded tacit consent to have Dill at his supper. You all call Miss Rachel right now and tell her where you are, she told him. She's running distracted looking for you. You watch out. She won't ship you back to Meridian first thing in the morning. Aunt Alexandra met us and nearly fainted when Calpurnia told us where we were. I guess it hurt her when we told her Atticus said we could come back, because she didn't say a word during supper. She just rearranged food on her plate, looking at it sadly while Calpurnia served Jim, Dill, and me with vengeance. Calpurnia poured milk, dished out potato salad and ham, muttering, Shame on yourselves, in varying degrees of intensity. Now you all eat slow, was her final command. Reverend Sykes had saved our places. We were surprised to find that we had gone nearly an hour, and were equally surprised to find the courtroom exactly as we had left it. With the minor changes, the jury box was empty, the defendant was gone. Judge Taylor had been gone, but he reappeared as we were seating ourselves. Nobody's moved hardly, said Jim. They moved around some when the jury went out, said Reverend Sykes. The men folk down there got the woman folk their suppers, and they fed their babies. How long have they been out? Asked Jim. About 30 minutes. Mr. Finch and Mr. Gilmer did some more talking, and Judge Taylor charged the jury. How was he? Asked Jim. What'd say? Oh, he did right well. I ain't complaining one bit. He was mighty fair-minded. He sort of said if you believe this, then you'll have to return one verdict. But if you believe this, you'll have to return another. I thought he was telling a little less on our side, Reverend Sykes scratching his head. Jim smiled. He's not supposed to lean, Reverend. But don't fret, we've won it, he said wisely. Don't see how any jury can convict on what we heard. Now, don't you be so confident, Mr. Jim. I ain't ever seen any jury decide in favor of a colored man over a white man. But Jim took exception to Reverend Sykes, and we were subjected to lengthy review of the evidence with Jim's idea of the law regarding rape. It wasn't rape if she let you, but she had to be 18. In Alabama, that is, in Maela, was 19. Apparently you had to kick and holler. You had to be overpowered and stomped on. Preferably knocked stone cold. If you were under 18, you didn't have to go through all this. Mr. Jim, Reverend Sykes demurred, this ain't a polite thing for little ladies to hear. Oh, she doesn't know what we're talking about, said Jim. Scout, this is too old for you, ain't it? It most certainly is not. I know every word you're saying. Perhaps I was too convincing because Jim hushed and never discussed the subject again. What time is it, Reverend? He asked. Getting on toward 8? I looked down and saw Atticus strolling around with his hands in his pockets. He made a tour of the windows, then walked by the railing over to the jury box. He looked in, inspected Judge Taylor on his throne, then went back to where he started. I caught his eye and waved it to him. He acknowledged my salute with a nod and resumed his tour. Mr. Gilmore was standing at the windows talking to Mr. Underwood. Bert, the court reporter, was chain-smoking. He sat back with his feet on the table. But the officers of the court, the ones present, Atticus, Mr. Gilmore, Judge Taylor, sound asleep, and Bert, were the only ones whose behavior seemed normal. I had never seen a packed courtroom so still. Sometimes a baby would cry out fretfully and a child would scurry out, but the grown people sat as if they were in church. In the balcony, the Negroes sat and stood around us with biblical patience. The old courthouse clock suffered its preliminary strain and struck the hour, 8 defending bongs that shook our bones. When it bonged 11 times, I was past feeling tired from the frightening sleep. I allowed myself a short nap against Reverend Sykes' comfortable arm and shoulder. I jerked awoke and made an honest effort to remain so, but by looking down and concentrating on the heads below, there were 16 bald ones, 14 men that could pass for rednecks, 40 heads varying between brown and black, and I remembered something Jim had once explained to me when he went through a brief period of physical research. He said if enough people, a stadium full maybe, were to concentrate on one thing, such as setting a tree afire in the woods, that the tree would ignite on its own accord. I toyed with the idea of asking everyone below to concentrate on setting Tom Robinson free, but they thought that if they were as tired as I, it wouldn't work. Dill was sound asleep, his head on Jim's shoulder, and Jim was quiet. Ain't it a long time, I asked. Sure is, Scout, he said happily. Well, from the way you put it, it just takes 5 minutes. Jim raised an eyebrow. There are things you don't understand, he said, and I was too weary to argue. Excuse me. But I must have been reasonably awake, or I would not have received the impression that was creeping into me. It was not unlike one I had last winter, and I shivered, though the night was hot. The feeling grew until the atmosphere in the courtroom was exactly the same as cold February morning, when the Mockingbirds were still, and the carpenters had stopped hammering on Miss Maudie's new house, and every wood door in the neighborhood was shut as tight as the doors in the Radley place. A deserted, waiting, empty street, and the courtroom was packed with people. A steaming summer night was no different from a winter morning. Mr. Hectate, who had entered the courtroom and was talking to Atticus, might have been wearing his high boots and lumber jacket. Atticus had stopped his tranquil journey and had put his foot onto the bottom rung of a chair as he listened to what Mr. Tate was saying. He ran his hand slowly up and down his thigh. I expected Mr. Tate to say any minute, "Take him, Mr. Finch." But Mr. Tate said, "This court will come to order," in a voice that rang with authority, and the heads below us jerked up. Mr. Tate left the room and returned with Tom Robinson. He steered Tom to his place beside Atticus and stood there. Judge Taylor had rounded himself to sudden alertness and was sitting up straight, looking at the empty jury box. What happened after that had a dreamlike quality. In a dream, I saw the jury return, moving like underwater swimmers. And Judge Taylor's voice came far away and was tiny. I saw something only a lawyer's child could be expected to see, could be expected to watch for. And it was like watching Atticus walk into the street, raise a rifle to his shoulder, pull the trigger, but watching all the time knowing that the gun was empty. A jury never looks at a defendant if it is convicted. And when this jury came in, not one of them looked at Tom Robinson. The foreman handed a piece of paper to Mr. Tate, who handed it to the clerk, who handed it to the judge. I shut my eyes. Judge Taylor was polling the jury. Guilty, 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 guilty. I peeked at Jim. His hands were white from gripping the balcony rail, and his shoulders jerked, as if each guilty was a separate stab between them. Judge Taylor was saying something. His gavel was in his fist, but he wasn't using it. Dimly, I saw Atticus pushing papers from the table into his briefcase. He snapped it shut, went to the court reporter and said something, nodded to Mr. Gilmer, and then went to Tom Robinson and whispered something to him. Atticus put his hand on Tom's shoulder as he whispered. Atticus took his coat off the back of his chair and pulled it over his shoulder. Then he left the courtroom, but not by his usual exit. He must have wanted to go home the short way because he walked quickly down the middle aisle toward the south exit. I followed the top of his head as he made his way to the door. He did not look up. Someone was punching me, but I was reluctant to take my eyes from the people below us and from the image of Atticus's lonely walk down the aisle. Miss Jean Louise? I looked around. They were standing all around us in the balcony on the opposite wall. The Negroes were getting to their feet. Reverend Sykes' voice was as distant as Judge Taylor's. Miss Jean Louise stood up. Your father's passing. Your father's passing. So that was the end of chapter 21. Despite the evidence proving his innocence, the jury had, the racist jury had convicted Tom Robinson. And, you know, the way they write this, it's so realistic and it's so like heartbreaking. You know, earlier today I was watching something on O.J. Simpson, and I remember being a little kid, you know, around Scout's age during the O.J. Simpson trial, and I didn't really understand what was going on, but I remember when they read the guilty verdict, you know, a lot of Caucasian white people were sad and a lot of black people were cheered. Like now today when the joke is like, oh, O.J. was so guilty, you know, it's I heard Charlemagne the God from the popular radio show, The Breakfast Club, he was saying those people who cheered for O.J. Simpson being innocent, you were on the wrong side of history. And I was always upset about that. Like, why'd they cheer? Cheer for him being not guilty. You know, why'd the black people cheer for him being found not guilty? He was obviously guilty. But then, like after reading something like this, and like you think about all the racism that has gone on against black people for years and years in courts. Like they didn't know any other way to react, you know, and I would do the same thing if I was in their position. When you look at all the tragedies of injustice that they have received in trials like exactly like this one, where a racist jury convicts an innocent man, and it's heartbreaking. And people need to have a conscience, and all men are created equal, you know. Atticus makes one of the best points in this part of the book that, like, there's bad white people, there's bad black people, there's good white people, there's good black people. So, like, I don't get out of racism. So, all right. Once again, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, and have a nice day.